A warm welcome to all of you. Those who come from the outside, I'm Joachim von Braun, President of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. A special warm welcome to our co-editors who were launching the idea of this book early on, and now we launched the product. And a especially warm welcome also to the contributors. Pope Francis said in a prayer in November of last year, I quote, "Robotics can make a better world possible if it is joined to the common good." So we have put this on the front page of our book. It emphasizes the possibilities, but it also has an if, and that relates very closely to our book. This open access book examines recent advances in how robotics and artificial intelligence have elicited widespread debate over the benefits and drawbacks for humanity. The technologies have implications within many sectors: health and medicine, employment, future of work, and transport, and manufacturing, and agriculture, and also in war and armed conflict. The volume covers multidisciplinary research and examines research frontiers and likely impacts on societal well-being. By today, the book has, and you know, a book launch shall facilitate readership, but readership is already there. By today, the book has been 30,000 times downloaded, according to the ticker on the website for this open access book, which I think is tremendously successful for the first 4 weeks since it has been made available. In this one-hour meeting, we want to briefly highlight messages and findings and also point at emerging research agendas. So I would like to ask now my colleague, President of the Pontifical Academy of Social Science, Stefano to say a few words. This was a joint undertaking between the two academies. So Stefano, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Thank you very much. Let me express my gratitude to the authors and editors of the book that the Pontifical Academy of Sciences is presenting today. The various contributions included in the collection offer relevant insights and original suggestions to tackle the many problems raised by the rapid dissemination of robotics and artificial intelligence. The future of humanity today is full of hopes and threats, as we know. And a collective assumption of responsibility is necessary in order to achieve those hopes and avert from those threats. The new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution can free human beings from the mere execution of tasks, allowing them to devote their energies to more satisfying and creative purposes. They can, however, also create a technological unemployment and new forms of labor alienation, not to mention the impact on global value chains and on geopolitics. Much depends on the philosophy, so to speak, that guides the new productive processes. Will it be a philosophy that aims solely at profit, or one that values workers' participation, care for the common good, and special concerns for social inequalities? This is a really important question, which is tackled in the book we are presenting. The new technologies have exerted an influence that has changed not only our interaction with the world, but also the understanding of ourselves. We do not perceive ourselves as isolated entities, but rather as interconnected informational bodies, or as we say, informed, sharing a global environment ultimately made of infosphere with biological agents and engineered artifacts. We need to combine the world of algorithms with the world of ethics to preserve the dignity of human work, to protect the dignity of the person. We need an algo ethic that protects us from the many forms of algocracy. The risk of algocracy are in front of us. A major challenge is the following. Digital technologies are surely raising global wealth, but global wealth will become global well-being only if market forces operate within a guiding moral framework grounded in human dignity and integral ecology. Inclusive prosperity and human interdevelopment are the two fundamental ideas that should guide our transformational project. And I do believe that the work done for the preparation of this important book goes in that direction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefano. Marcelo, please give us some words of welcome. We would have loved to be around you in the Casina and do the book launch there, but at least you are there. Please.
Well, I only want to thank to both presidents and to both academies, because really was a great effort and a great success. I want to thank especially President Joachim and also Greg, because they was clear the columns of this publication. But also I want to thank Margaret Thatcher, because was in the beginning an initiative came from Margaret. I remember, I don't believe that this could be possible, because the Academy of Sciences have already made other meetings about the same subject, and was complicated, but really was, the result was very, very superior at the things that we can imagine. So great things, and congratulations. And this shows that if the Academy sometimes work together, could have a very, very good result. So this is an initiative that we can repeat. And of course, I agree with all the things that say the president of the future of this entity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelo. We will have 5 brief statements, please not more than 4 or 5 minutes, because we want to have many of the authors, chapter authors who are with us, also take the floor with comments thereafter. And if there are questions among us and among the audience, we want to give space to that. So the first statement comes from Wolf Singer, who is a professor in Frankfurt at the Ernst Stringman Institute for Neuroscience. Wolf, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joachim. Well, I think my task was to compare artificial intelligence systems with natural intelligence systems. And I think the most remarkable comparison that one can make is to compare a fruit fly with a supercomputer. The fruit fly leads an autonomous life, reproduces, survives in a hostile environment, and is endowed with intentionality. It can decide to go and fly right or left. While a supercomputer has about the energy consumption of a mid-sized town, is exceedingly effective in categorizing complex patterns, and also, if trained well, can perform superhuman abilities in chess playing and Go playing. And so the question is, do these systems resemble each other, and where is the categorical difference? Now, apart from evolution being unbeatable with respect to realizing systems on the micro scale, there are fundamental differences in the architecture of these systems, and hence also in the algorithms according to which they work. The artificial intelligence systems that we all talk about now, the deep learning networks, that perform these pattern recognition tasks so beautifully well, can read traffic signs and much more. They are relatively simple, multi-layer, feed-forward linear systems where in each layer you have a large number of nodes. These are very simplified neuronal elements that can just integrate and then pass the result of the integration onwards to the next layer through bifurcating and converging connections. And then these networks are trained by showing them millions and millions of examples on the input layer and adjusting the weights of the feed-forward connections until the output is what one wants. So they have supervised learning algorithms, and the way in which they learn is highly artificial, has nothing to do with how natural systems learn. They have to be instructed to change the weights according to a steepest descent algorithm. This is about what these artificial systems do. The natural systems, and one finds these architectures in fruit flies as well as in the cerebral cortex of humans. There the layers are characterized by a massive network of recurrent connections which couple the nodes among each other. And this reciprocal coupling gives rise to an extremely complex, very, very high dimensional, some people say it's an infinite dimensional dynamic space. And from all we think we know, nature exploits this extremely high dimensional dynamics in order to perform computations in this space, which allows for huge storage of information because the space has so many dimensions, for the separation of representations in this high dimensional space, and for massive parallel computation, which may be the key for the speed with which these natural systems can operate, given that neurons are orders of magnitude slower than artificial systems, than transistors, for example. So there are architectural differences, and there are enormous differences with respect to dynamics. The artificial systems, they lack dynamics, they lack memory in a sense that they can process sequences of events and integrate over them. So there are good reasons to believe that there are principles that nature has discovered that we are still struggling with and have not understood fully, because we have not yet understood how the cerebral cortex works. There must be algorithms that we have not yet uncovered, and the same is probably true for the brain of the fruit fly, because some of the principles are similar. After having elaborated on these differences, I dare to discuss a little bit the question that is addressed so often. Can these artificial systems develop something that we consider consciousness? With all the reservations of the term consciousness, which is probably the most ill-defined term that we can use in science. And I think the discussions that we are having there, they really fall short of the fact that what we consider conscious behavior or the qualia of our conscious experience, that these are massively influenced by epigenetic factors, i.e. by cultural attributions. We have a long history of cultural evolution that has given us mathematics and language and allows us to communicate about our perceptions of the respective other. And this creates a whole world of, as we call it, social realities, intangible concepts that we attribute to each other, which, however, have an immaterial connotation. A belief system cannot be reduced to a material interaction. Now, we have evolved in such systems that are full with social realities, and therefore our consciousness is the result of course, certain cognitive brain functions, but to a large extent is the result of interpersonal interactions, attributions, and the creation of a mental, spiritual, or psychological, at least in all cases, immaterial dimension. And this is where we evolve in addition to our material existence. And if one takes those considerations into account, artificial systems will have a long way to go before they develop even a spurious sort of what we address as consciousness, they would have to develop, or they would have to be embedded in our cultural system. They would have to evolve with us. They would have to have this epigenetic shaping that we all have on the way from a baby to an adult. And all this is so far in the future that I think all the worries that these guys will develop intentionality, conscious awareness, and finally qualia and a culture of their own is so far away that we don't have to worry. This is, I think, what I will be closing with.
Thank you, Wolf. Next comes Timothy De Stefano. He's with the OECD Structural and Industry Policy Division in a lead position with the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. Timothy, your maximum 5 minutes, please.
Very nice to meet everybody. Actually, I just moved to Harvard Business School, so I swapped.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Kuhn and I addressed this research from the perspective of trying to understand the economic implications of emerging technologies on our society. And one of the things that we realized when we started looking at technological progression is that it's occurring at a breakneck pace. And we focused here on particular technologies around artificial intelligence, but more specifically robotics. And the reason why we wanted to do this is because we knew that the technology was going to have profound effects on people and business and society. We know that these technologies are likely to be very disruptive, which means that they're probably going to benefit some people and others much less so. In these scenarios, these types of technologies create winners and losers. Typically, there's a winner-take-all scenario where successful people or businesses are able to harness most of the benefits from these technologies, while the minority of firms and people benefit much less. So what we try and do here is we try and explore a small yet growing gap in the literature on the impact of robotics on the economy. The literature is quite small, but it's growing, whereas most of the research has focused on the impact of these technologies on labor, and predominantly almost all the work on robots and technology more generally typically focuses within very rich developed economies. So what we try and do here is we try and address another question outside of labor, but looks at it from a different lens of how industrial robotics are impacting the way in which multinational corporations are organizing production through value chains. And the questions that we want to try and address with this research is the extent to which the technology is having an impact on the reshoring of jobs away from emerging markets back to developed economies. And we think this work has interesting implications for society and well-being of both those that typically held blue-collar work in the developed economy and those that recently took up work in emerging economies. Like we mentioned before, these technologies are likely to create winner-take-all scenarios. So we really want to drill down and understand the economic implications of this technology by looking at it both between developed and emerging economies to try and get an understanding of what these recent trends are. Anecdotally, we know that robots may reduce the cost and the labor advantage that a lot of the emerging economies have had. We know that since the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of jobs were outsourced to emerging markets because the gap in labor was very large. But as robots become much more dexterous and they're able to carry out more jobs at a cheaper rate, this is going to reduce that labor gap. And it means most likely that a lot of the manufacturing jobs that were previously outsourced may go back to developed economies. And we need to understand that trend, and we need to understand how that's going to impact both our neighbors and friends and wealthy economies, but also those in less fortunate and growing economies. So overall, our results show that the diffusion of industrial robots does appear to be slowing down outsourcing. And we find that this is a much more recent trend. I must note that our study stopped in 2015, and it's likely that that trend has continued or even picked up. What we don't find, however, is that outsourcing has stopped, but just the rate at which it's occurring is slowing down, which we find some empirical evidence that's attributed to growth in the use of robotics in developed economies. We do, however, don't find, at least now, any evidence that there's a reshoring effect. i.e. that multinationals are using robots to bring jobs away from their foreign affiliates back home. But again, we do find that the diffusion of jobs away from rich countries to poor countries is slowing quite dramatically. And this may be the start of an ongoing trend. Somewhat more differently, and from a different perspective, we do show that employment growth within multinational corporation is occurring within affiliates that are using robotics the most. So contrary to the belief, at least within multinational corporations, that robots eliminate employment, what we find is that those that are most likely to use the technology are more likely to hire people. And this is most likely linked to the fact that those that are using the technology are growing and expanding and are more likely to need more workers. It also means that they tend to be more productive and that they pay higher wages than firms that are less productive. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, I think. Again, like I said, this research only goes up to 2015. We know based on the pandemic that global value chains are very vulnerable, in particular with how complex they've become. We hear, it's very common now to hear amongst politicians leaning towards policies of independence and independence of production of certain goods. And we're likely to see a further decoupling of our complex global value chains, I think, going on into the future. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. Most of the work, like I said, is done on technology and developed economies, but we need to have a better understanding of the impact that it's having in emerging markets. I did a recent paper, sort of an extension of this one, which looks at robotics from a different perspective. And this is one which assesses the extent to which the technology allows producer to produce higher quality products. And what we find in that study is actually somewhat different from this, in that the diffusion of robots up until from the 1990s to about 2005, the predominance of the adoption was occurring in very wealthy economies. But since then, there's been considerable catch up in emerging markets. And with that catch up, we found that the quality of goods that emerging economies are producing is catching up to the quality of goods that the richest countries are producing. And this means that there's going to be links with development and growth and employment growth of these poorer countries. So there's another facet with which we think robots are likely to improve the livelihoods of people in emerging markets, aside the potential cause and effect of people and jobs being reallocated across space in time. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. My co-author got to come to Rome last year, and now he's in sunny Australia. So he tends to find himself on the right side of the coin every time. But again, I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thank you.
We will create another opportunity for you. Thank you, Tim. Gregory Reichberg is research professor at Peace Research Institute in Oslo, abbreviated as PRIO. And Greg is a co-editor. It was a pleasure to work with you, Greg. You have the floor. You need to unmute. You need to ask Andreas to unmute you.
Mute. Okay. I'm unmuted now. So just to say, Joachim, it was a great pleasure working with you. You were the driving force behind the volume. You really kept us on track the whole way along. I'm also grateful to my other fellow editors, Margaret and Marcelo, and this steadfast efforts in bringing this ambitious undertaking to completion. Now, as co-editor, my main responsibility was to coordinate the book chapters that deal expressly with normative issues. I thank the respective authors, some of whom were here, for their outstanding contributions and friendly cooperation throughout the editorial process. When I was first invited to help organize the Pontifical Academy's conference on which this volume is based, I knew very little about robotics and AI. It has been a steep learning curve, but one well worth it. Now I can understand much better what Wolf Singer is talking about than 2 years ago. So I feel like I've made, I've come along. This is a fascinating domain, and the more I read into it, the more fascinating it becomes. Thus far, my work is focused on the ethical dimensions of AI military applications. And in fact, while this book has been in production, I've received 2 grants to work on this topic. One from the Research Council of Norway, which generously contributed towards the open access fee for the volume. The other from the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. That project has for short title Al Gore Ethics. And I told some colleagues about it at a recent meeting, and someone said afterwards, "What? Tell me again, what does this have to do with Al Gore?" However, looking forward, I'd like to reflect more broadly on AI and robotics, particularly their religious implications. The trend towards general AI raises challenging questions about the place of these new entities in the metaphysical order of what God has created. There has been much talk, for instance, about machine superintelligence, how this potentially new form of intelligence fits in with the traditional religious understanding of the hierarchy of minded beings. Non-human animals, human animals, purely immaterial substances, better known as angels, and God. God is a minded being. How this fits in really merits, I think, careful consideration. However, for this volume, my efforts concentrated on the military applications of AI. And in addition to the chapter I co-authored with my colleague, Henrik Siese, who I think is present here, there were 2 others, one by Bruce Sweat, also present here, and his team, and the other by Professor Nobu Akiyama at Hitso Tsubashi University in Tokyo. My and Henrik's chapter in the volume focuses on recent ethical debates surrounding the battlefield use of robots with attack capabilities. Human-controlled, remotely operated robots have been around for quite some time, as with drones, for instance. While these have already been the subject of much ethical debate, and rightly so, in our chapter, we concerned ourselves with the moral questions that can be raised apropos of robots that are designed to function in autonomous mode, namely without the direct guiding influence of a human decision maker. AI is what makes possible this machine autonomy. Here, the full targeting loop, orient, observe, decide, and engage, destroy a particular target, can be carried out by the AI robot entity itself. This entity would have delegated authority potentially to harm or kill opposing human combatants. In examining the moral status of these lethal autonomous or so-called killer robots, we don't reach a firm conclusion against their use in battlefield settings. Our goal was rather to elucidate the main arguments pro and con against their use, vis-a-vis their use. Some of these arguments are principled in kind. For instance, when it is claimed that to be killed by machine decision would debase warfare into mere slaughter, as though the enemy combatant were on a par with an animal killed on an automated conveyor belt. On the opposing pro side, some argue that AI-directed robotic combatants would have an advantage over their human counterparts insofar as the robots would operate solely on the basis of rational assessment. While in the heat of battle, humans are often swayed by emotions, fear, anger, hatred, that conduce to poor judgment and lead to battlefield atrocities. Alongside principal arguments such as these, we also examined various pragmatic arguments for and against battlefield robots. For instance, that in comparison with humans, these combatants would be capable of more discriminate targeting. They could use force to disable enemy fighters rather than killing them, or more generally, that there would be reduced battlefield deaths, at least for the side deploying them. On the opposing side, it is maintained that the discrimination of combatants from non-combatants depends on a complex set of variables that machine will be unable to reliably assess, so that the battlefield deployment of autonomous robots would place unacceptable levels of risk on civilians. There is also the problem of unintended consequences. Systems can fail to turn off when they should, are susceptible to cyber intrusion, so-called adversarial AI, or could be used for purposes other than what their developers intended, say to intimidate or even to commit genocide against a civilian population. All right, my time is up. But basically, in the concluding part of the paper, we make the point that these autonomous weapon systems are largely not yet in in operation. Some militaries like the US have a moratorium on their use. But there are plenty of other ways that AI devices are now in use by military organizations. And most of these are to augment, enhance human decision-making, contribute to human decision-making. And this area has largely been neglected. And there are important ethical issues that need to be raised here also. So we more or less finish with a plea for further investigation into human-machine, the ethical dimensions of human-machine collaboration in battlefield settings. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. Our next speaker is Professor Margaret Archer, professor at the University of Warwick. Margaret, you can accept the title of mother of this book. You triggered it, you called on me whether we shouldn't do this together. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And you have the floor.
Thank you. This is a deliberately provocative paper chapter. When my research center, which is called Center for Social Ontology, began working on this, we were all completely ignorant and had to tackle this mass of books. And in doing so, something struck me immediately. There was a straightforward division between what I call robophobia, those who fear robots, and robophilia, those who contemplate, as Alan Turing did, a future of collaboration being possible. So these are the kinds of weird contributions that our center makes to intellectual life. We're primarily a philosophy of social science set up. We have no specialized knowledge whatsoever about robotics, but we think we're fast learners. So to start this discussion off with my own group and then within the academy a little bit, I put forward a thought experiment, which is something that philosophers do the whole time. It's not regarded as extraordinary. And this was the possibility considered favorably for friendship developing between AI entities and human beings. And it's not an advocacy of this point of view, it's a thought experiment. It's not a current possibility at the moment, largely, I think, because there's this extreme paucity in all the excellent research that's been done of any consideration of AI to AI conversation interaction and AI human interaction. I find that peculiar. If somebody could enlighten me, I'd be grateful. So what this thought experiment does is to venture, and it is a venture, the conditions under which friendship could potentially develop. And the main condition that I'll dwell on in the remaining 4 minutes or whatever is synergy, whose holding to its original meaning of co-working. Co-working between an AI, who I call Ali, and a distinguished human research professor, Homer. And this is an examination, an abstract examination of this co-working as joint action, something that Authorial team has worked on extensively, but again, without recordings and without capacity to question the AI doing the table test. So to begin with, what were the presumptions about Ali? That he was pre-programmed with language use and language recognition. He had learning ability. He had error correction ability and some capacity to adapt himself to his environment. I say he, it could be she. I prefer it wasn't it, because it's do not engage in friendship. So the fictional story features a medical research program, and its project is to eliminate tumor X, which is fatal to human beings. Of course, that's fictional too. Now, previously, I've examined the main barriers that the literature has thrown up against synergy, co-working, collaboration, and eventually friendship between the wet and the dry. But I won't have time even to mention anything beyond normativity, emotionality, the existence of qualia, etc. here. I'll just dwell upon what I see as a fascinating possibility for research, which is Ali's capacity for reflexivity. Now, reflexivity is certainly one aspect of consciousness. It's the one I've worked on most with human beings. I have a trilogy of books on this based on empirical research. And one of the main things it starts off doing is to say, let's abandon the traditional historical term introspection. Let it go. And let's replace it by the internal conversation. Now, this relies and is derived from William James's late 19th century psychology and Charles Saunders Peirce. And what they argue to me fully convincingly is that we are all, and that would include Ali, as language users, we are speakers and listeners of ourselves. We can broadcast it, we can share it, we don't have to. But that makes us both simultaneously subject who produces an utterance and object, little time interval, that was their crucial contribution, little time interval in which they inspect internally their object, the utterance that they have made. And William James puts it beautifully. We welcome some of these utterances and we feel very dissatisfied with other ones that we make, but then we can go and revise them if it's an internal conversation. So, you know, you may say internally, I hate him, whoever he may be. And then you think, no, that's overdoing it. Let me reformulate that. There are many things I dislike about him, but not all. Now, that can go on, as you'll see in the diagram in the book. We can revise and revise until we are satisfied. This is the ultimate authorial authority of the internal speaker. And authorial authority is not very popular these days. Nevertheless, I don't think it can be eliminated. Now, in sociolinguistics, all conversation involves turn-taking. This is its main structural feature, if you like. And there's always a small gap between question and answer. And there is that in the internal conversation too. So the guts, the heart of human reflexivity is this capacity. And I asked the question in the fictional story, what stops Ali, a competent language user, preloaded from his program certainly, but a competent language user, what stops him from doing the same thing? And my answer to my audience is nothing. Except that there is this sort of built-in individualism, not in what Greg was talking about, which is the battalions of drones, if you like, that are currently employed in various kinds of military activities, but one single AI entity. And that's unfortunate. Instead, this thought experiment doesn't involve imputing anything extra or special to AI, and certainly not to an individual Ali, but it deals with the dyad, because the dyad has emergent properties and powers that individuals don't possess. We all recognize this. And it's what my fictional story is about. There's no determinism. Professor Homer could treat Ali like a complete subordinate, confined to doing his compilation and computation on the basic old-fashioned command and control model. But Homer being a monomaniac, Homer being a rather lonely man, verbalizes out loud, I don't know where I'm going next. I don't know what to do. If we had
Margaret, we need to come to a close.
Okay. So
Thank you.
Can I have my last sentence, please?
Yes, please.
Well, it's simply that there's a lot of complimentary statements made about AI as carers for autistic children, elderly people, first stages of dementia. And my ending argument would be, if we developed the dyadic interaction between the carer and the cared for, the care quality could increase enormously. The elderly could be better served than by equivalents of Alexa and Siri.
Thank you.
And that would be because the care was more humane. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Last not least comes Amy van Winsberge, the Alexander von Humboldt Professor for Applied Ethics of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Bonn in Germany. Amy will address responsible robotics and responsibility attribution. Amy?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Nice to see many of you again. So I will try and do this as quickly as possible so that we can wrap up. The focus of my paper was on robotics as opposed to artificial intelligence. And when I began in the robotics space, this was back in about 2004, and I was part of an engineering team where we were training surgeons how to use surgical robots, and also what happens if we introduce some kind of a delay when they move their hands and the robotic apparatus is actually going to move. And so it was about 15 years ago that I started thinking about the ethical issues and the ethical questions, but it was still very much a niche topic. People weren't, we didn't have workshops like this where we could all come together and think together on these issues. So I've noticed over the last 15 years that there's this growing interest in how do we uncover ethical issues? What are the ethical issues? How do we make sense of them? Still, though, even though there is this growing interest, there's no systematic way of how we can do this. So this paper is really trying to create a procedure for uncovering the ethical issues, and then assigning responsibility for individuals or groups of individuals who are responsible to do something about these ethical issues. Now, in order to do that, I pick up on the work of Murphy and Woods, and they wrote the paper called The New Laws of Responsible Robotics. Frank Pasquale has also actually written a book of a similar title. Frank was at the conference a year and a half ago or so. And so what I did was to try and unpack this concept of responsible robotics. And to do that, I wanted to show that there was much more nuance and depth to the term responsibility. Because oftentimes it's used, well, you know, we should have responsible robotics, we should be responsible for this technology, but what does that really mean? So the paper is about going into depth into ethical concepts like this to try and make sense of them so that we can create a procedure for what to do with these very rich concepts. The paper also goes into the issue that sometimes when we're talking about creating procedures or investigating the ethical issues about human-robot interactions, we reduce the human-robot interaction to just a human and a robot interacting, when really the robot is entering into an infrastructure and is changing the entire infrastructure, right? So in the healthcare system, the training of healthcare professionals has to change, money allocation has to change. So the robots should be evaluated in this sort of socio-technical system rather than just sort of the robot and the human interacting. So I go through all of the different reasons why we need to have a kind of larger scope, the meaning of responsibility, and then I suggest two phases. That we have one phase where we have groups of individuals who are responsible for uncovering the ethical issues. So this could be through an ethical technology assessment or some sort of tool. And then we have another phase where we assign responsibility. And to assign responsibility, we have to look at a variety of criteria, like the type of robot. Are we talking about a surgical robot? Are we talking about a drone? We have to look at the stage of development. The ethical issues related to the robot will differ depending on the stage of development. We need to look at the context of use. Are these robots in agriculture, robots in healthcare? This again helps us to identify who could be responsible for the ethical issues that we are uncovering, and robot acquisition. So if we think about an issue like sustainability and circular recyclability of the robot, do we make academics responsible for the environmental consequences, even though oftentimes they are procuring a robot that is, commercially available? Or is that something where industry has to be responsible? So it's providing a level of granularity in order to identify who is responsible for a variety of different ethical issues. The last point that I wanted to make is that while I am creating this sort of framework, this procedural approach for assigning responsibilities, I also indicate that there are some things missing. The first thing that is missing is that, of course, you can have a company or an academic check all of the boxes in terms of, they have uncovered these ethical issues, they have someone responsible, but that doesn't cover the entire question. That's how should we create the robot, but not necessarily should we make this robot. So robots to babysit children, for example. We can go through how we should do it, but that's a very different question from should we have robots in these existential situations. The last point was who does the allocation of responsibility. So wonderful that Paul Nemitz is in the room, someone from the policymaking, the regulatory space. It is a question, we can have this framework, but then who do we give the responsibility to actually say, you are responsible for this kind of group of ethical issues, and so on and so forth. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for these illuminating speeches. Colleagues, a book launch is no substitute for reading the book. Let me just throw a few questions and asking colleagues who were co-authors or authors of chapters to respond with one sentence to a question from me. Massimo Torero has contributed a chapter on agriculture. What is the top opportunity of robotics in farming? One sentence, Massimo.
It's a way that we can increase efficiency, and automation is happening, but especially if it is scale neutral. And that's where the innovation is to change, so that it's more inclusive for smallholders, which is the majority of farmers in the world right now.
Pierre Lena, What's the top opportunity of AI and robotics in education, Pierre?
The challenge for education in emerging countries, and especially with demographic change like Africa, is to provide teachers in sufficient numbers. I don't think AI will ever replace a teacher in front of children, but given the unbalance between the availability of teachers and the needs for the young children, probably AI, or at least AI-assisted education, I'm not speaking about robot teachers, is a solution which will be explored one way or another. Thank you, Joachim.
Wolfgang Schröder, what's at the top of the agenda of the legal profession when it comes to regulation in AI and robotics? And I will ask thereafter you, Angela Kane, what's at the top of the regulatory agenda currently? Wolfgang?
Well, right now I'm very busy with standardization of AI systems, and that's, so to say, on the top of my list. But my claim in the book was that we should maintain an ethical continuum. So we should show some respect even to robots, not for the sake of robots, but for the sake of humans, so that there is no lack of responsibility or good behavior in human behavior. So that was my claim in one sentence.
Mm-hmm. Angela,
when it comes to regulating robotics or emerging technologies, it's very difficult simply because governments don't own it. It's all in private industry. So how do you actually regulate technologies that are privately owned rather than owned by governments? And what has happened also over the last couple of years is that we have seen a tremendous change in the geopolitical nature of what we're facing. I mean, there's been a tremendous rift between the US and China. You've had Russia becoming more isolated, but those are very powerful players in the AI field. So that does not make it easier. And what I think you have to basically aim at is not necessarily to regulate it, but to just sort of see what could be agreed on as best practices, or what could be agreed on as avoiding to the maximum extent possible. I think that's about the best that we can hope for right now.
Okay. Who would like to soundbite to this fast book launch? If not, I will ask you, Stefano, to make a closing remark. Stefano, unmute. You need your microphone, Stefano.
So sorry. Well, just to conclude, what we are experiencing today bears striking similarities in size and implication to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. The discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo challenged our whole understanding of the world around us and forced us as humans to rethink our place within it. Now, the fourth industrial revolution forces us to answer a more profound question. What does it mean to be human in the age of artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc.? If machines can compete with people in thinking, what makes us humans unique? The answer is perhaps the one thing that machines will never have, namely a heart. Humans can love, have compassion, and can dream. Humans can build a relationship of trust, and so I think that it's a guiding line for our future research. Thank you very much to everybody, and let us continue along the path which we have just initiated. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcelo, please. Marcelo, your mic.
After all these very interesting interventions, I may for me, for myself, the question is the robot can pray, because many philosophers say that the more important activity that can develop the human being is to pray, to be in contact with God. As a bishop, I'm very interested in these things. And I see that Greg says something about this, about the use of the robots in the liturgy or this kind of something. So anyway, I am very interested, and this is a new thing that we need to continue to study what are the possibility of this instrument. But the question, the fundamental question for me is to put really the robots at service of the human being, of the common good and justice, and not at service of the people to have the power and the money. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelo. Let me just underline one point. Protecting people's and individuals' human rights and privacy is an important issue that will unfold more and more in the future. Finding appropriate regulation, as just mentioned by colleagues, for good national and international governance of AI and of robotics is important. We will need to revisit this topic. You know, in the pontifical academies, we don't jump from topic to topic. We stay on a theme as it unfolds. This workshop was the third on robotics and AI. And I predict in a couple of years, 2-3 years, we will revisit it because it's a very fast evolving theme. Marcelo, I agree that it's probably difficult to imagine that robots can pray, but let me refer to Pope, let me refer to Pope Francis' statement at the top of our book, which says, let us pray that the progress of robotics and artificial intelligence may always serve humankind. We could say, may it be human. So we can pray for good robots and good AI and actually work busily as scientists for it and influence policy and regulatory frameworks to our best abilities. Colleagues, it was a pleasure to have you around. I thank you all for having joined. I see there are very distinguished members of the Pontifical Academies with us. This was just set for 1 hour because we are in this haunting times of one Zoom conference after the other, but this was a particular pleasure. Thank you again and goodbye.